one of the many sometimes frustrating things about living in an apartment building are the noises off. You might think it's nice and quiet when you sit down to record, but you wait for it. There might not be a fire truck going by, but the 6-year-old downstairs might decide that now is the absolute perfect time to run, because if you're 6, it is almost always the absolutely perfect time to run. I have a monthly wrap-up today for January of 2021. A very mixed month for me. It started off very promisingly. I was reading Duck's Newburyport by Elman, finally getting around to that, and was making great for me headway on it. It was about a quarter of the way through and reading a nice chunk of it every day at a nice pace and getting into the rhythm of the novel and starting to see and understand how it's structured. And then January 6th happened, and all of the kind of rippling through of gun violence in just the first quarter of that novel became a little bit too much for me. So I put it aside and read a stack of other things instead. What I read was largely kind of middling stuff, and almost all of it from the library. I read a couple of non-fiction books, 3. I've got 2 of them here, and one of them went back to the library. I'll show you the most niche one. This is Telling the Truth. It's essentially a locally published, largely oral history of segregated schools in Nova Scotia. Most people are, I think, pretty unaware that schools in Nova Scotia were segregated up until the late 80s or 90s. Since most people are really not aware of how long schools were segregated, especially at the elementary level in Nova Scotia, this is a useful text for getting a sense of how widespread school segregation was, especially in rural Nova Scotia. It's not a particularly strong work of history. It's essentially an amateur history with a little bit of oral history thrown into it, so useful as a starting point, but not formal history. Which I would love to read a formal history book about segregated schools in Nova Scotia, race segregated. There are also segregated schools by religion here as well. I think there's probably a really good graduate work to be done on segregated schools. Unfortunately, most of the women and handful of men who taught in those schools have died by now. But still, I think it would be a fascinating topic for someone to pick up. The other work of history I read was A Woman of No Importance by Sonia Purnell, and this is the account of Virginia Hall, who worked as a resistance fighter in France in 1942, 43, 44, and ran various resistance organizations for about a year and a half to 2 years. It's an interesting account. It's got that standard World War II women accomplish things look to it. It has the image of a woman walking away from you, which is very typical of these kinds of books, and it's a fascinating kind of marketing ploy. So A Woman of No Importance is kind of a middle-of-the-road popular history. It's got a good set of footnotes and references, which is something I always appreciate in a work of history. Over the last 4 or 5 years, I've read 3 or 4 of these kinds of works, a couple of biographies, a couple of works of fiction of women in war in the European theatre who accomplished great things. These are essentially histories that are rescuing stories that have been untold, that kind of motif. And sometimes they're like catnip. There's something about the cover of them, I think, that makes them appealing. But ultimately, I find them often quite frustrating to read. This one, the Purnell, is not as frustrating as some of the others that I've read recently, because it's got a good apparatus, it's got good footnotes to it. But all of these texts have a similar kind of frustration for me. They all kind of evade the issue of sexual violence in war. And it's a kind of odd maneuver, especially in 2020 or 2021, that these accounts of women's work in war can't talk about, not even indirectly it seems, the reality of sexual violence in war. It's a very odd thing when you get down to it and think about it a little bit. It's very odd that we want to celebrate the accomplishments of women in war, but still can't, as a culture, face, it seems to me, face the reality of things like sexual violence, unwanted pregnancy, or the fear of those things. In January, I also read Andrea Bennett's fairly recent collection, Like a Boy But Not a Boy. This is published by Arsenal Pulp Press, a lefty press in Vancouver. And it's a mix of short biographies of queer millennials in Canada, 15, 20 little biographies, and Bennett's personal essays, which cover her history, how she grew up, how she became a writer, how she worked for a long time as a bicycle mechanic, and her gradual move into and success as a writer in Canada, and some of the difficulties that posed. Some of the more interesting pieces in here talk about the gender dynamics of the Canadian literary scene, and not just the contemporary Canadian literary scene, but things that were happening in the late 60s and early 70s. If you'd like to get kind of an insight into Margaret Atwood's role in Canada from kind of a not wildly happy with Atwood point of view, there's a good essay in here that will help you understand why Atwood is kind of an ambivalent figure among younger Canadians now. Bennett identifies as non-binary and uses either they-them pronouns or she-her pronouns. Bennett's essays about parenting and feeding her child and the difficulties of breastfeeding versus chest feeding and the gender dynamics of parenting are also quite good. So I would recommend this if you're interested in the personal essay and in understanding more about the lives of non-binary people and non-binary parents. I think the book that's probably going to stick with me the longest from my January reading is this little biography by Jennifer Clement called The Widow Basquiat. So this came out originally in 2000 and was republished in 2014, I think. And this is a very slim biography, and it deals with Suzanne Malloch's life with Jean-Michel Basquiat, and a little bit of her adolescence and childhood. It covers maybe 3 or 4 years of her life and Basquiat's life, and it's structurally quite unusual, it seems to me. It's divided up into many small chapters and chunks, little chapters like that. So very fragmented, but then fragmented even further because usually each chapter will start with a headline or a title that is more or less cryptic, then a chunk of third-person narrative, which is pretty kind of popular biography in its tone and approach, and then a section which sometimes elaborates on or contradicts or complicates the kind of standard biographical passages that is, or purports to be, a direct quotation from Suzanne. And it's an odd kind of narrative approach, and it's effective. If you like Eve Babbitt's work, which can often be pretty fragmented but feel as if it's often moving between fiction and nonfiction over the course of a chapter or even within a couple of pages, you might like this. It's entirely unsourced. There's no footnotes, no context setting portion, so it's entirely unclear when or how the first person portions of this were recorded or created. So it's kind of fascinating as an approach to fragmented biography. It's quite frank in dealing with both Basquiat and Malloch's cocaine and heroin addictions. Talks about the music scene, the art scene, New York in the 80s, just as it was the AIDS crisis was ramping up. One of the other notable things I read in January was Beryl Bainbridge's A Weekend at Claude's. Something she published originally in 1968 and then revised in the mid-1980s. I have a goal of rereading all of Bainbridge's novels this year. I read most of them, but not all of them, and I hadn't read this one before. And it's an odd book in some ways because it's been revised and I have no way of telling what it was like originally before she tweaked it a little bit. It's a very typical kind of Bainbridge novel. It's a group of people who aren't very likable, they don't like each other, they don't like themselves, are together in a kind of a compressed or claustrophobic environment in which something happens, but it's not really clear what has happened or why something has happened. And it's all told in this very claustrophobic, tight prose style, which I enjoy, but I'm not sure that A Weekend in Claude is actually a particularly strong novel. I'm glad to have gotten the first of my Bainbridge rereads out of the way. That was my January in reading. Some middle-of-the-road things, some pretty good things, and the things that were kind of disappointing will just pass by in silence for now. I hope you have some interesting reading to see you through the storm if you're on the east coast of Canada or the United States, and that you're not stuck shoveling and shoveling and shoveling and shoveling, or not stuck without power for more than an evening. Take care. Bye-bye.